Okay, the timer's going, it's happening. Before I get started, I just thought can we do one more quick round of applause for all the organizers and just keep it going for the volunteers, the people who are filming, the people who have been helping with coffee, the people who gave us food. Just keep it going a little bit longer. It's almost done. Oh, that feels good. So I put this slide in front of every presentation, and then I do this, and I turn around, and I look up. You can't really see it. It's a psychedelic cat. I just kind of do this. And the first time I did it, it was mostly about making myself not nervous anymore, because it was just kind of a cool thing. And I highly advise, if you do talks, do something silly like this to distract yourself. But eventually I stopped getting as nervous, but it turned out that it was a really great way to find out quickly if the audience was cool. Because if y'all don't laugh, I'm totally fucked. Because this is basically, no, this talk is actually pretty serious, so it's not all going to be psychedelic cats. But before we dig into that, I'm Myles. I'm gainfully employed by a company called Google as a developer advocate working for Node.JS on Google Cloud Platform. Well, it's a lot of words, it's a lot of things. Grab me afterwards if you want to know what that means. These words, also always put that in your talk. These are my own words, these are not my company's words. This is about my own experiences, most of which happened before I even joined. So yeah. Also, this is a heavy and serious talk, so I'm going to open it with some trigger warnings. We are going to talk about suicide. We're going to talk about trolling. We're going to talk about harassment. We're going to talk about misogyny and racism. If any of these make you uncomfortable, if at any point during the talk you're kind of this is not what I want to do right now. There's bars nearby, there's an ice cream parlor. Get up, walk out, it's totally cool. You're not hurting my feelings at all. But I want to make sure everyone has a second to kind of take that in and just know, if you're uncomfortable at all during this talk, please just leave, it's totally cool. I'm going to be doing that a lot too. I've been involved in many communities leading up to where I am. I started with communities that I'm really proud of, and one of those is the MONOME community. It's an open source and open hardware community for making music. I actually started programming to learn how to make cool electronic music, and the first thing I ever soldered was a MONOME that I built at home, because I thought it would be cheaper to build a kit. It's not. MONOME was great and really supportive, and I ended up getting my first job in open source at this company called Famous. You maybe can't see there's a fee there. I can kind of trace it out. But it was a company that was doing 3D animation in the browser. It was cool and exciting. It was an open source JavaScript platform that raised a $10 million Series B round and a $100 million valuation with no to market strategy. I have stories, but I'm not going to tell them when I'm recorded on stage. But I worked as, whoa, the sound got really loud. I worked leading the open source efforts there, and I worked really closely with an extremely active and enthusiastic community. And I didn't realize at the time how lucky we were that things were actually pretty mild. The biggest problems we had were internal developers who didn't want to put time into supporting open source stuff. But that's not what we're talking about today. In the last number of years, I've been heavily involved in the Node.js community. I sit on the CTC and the TSC. If you use any LTS version, I've likely released that version of Node. And I've helped to craft a lot of our release processes that we're using now. And in the Node community, I've learned a lot about what it means to be a leader. And part of that is in being a leader myself, and also in the way in which leaders fail. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's also some communities that I'm not as proud and excited to be a part of. We'll just skip through those. I actually have in my browser 2 tabs. One says "you are" and the other says "better than this," and those are the links to Hacker News and Reddit. I once did a screencast and someone got really upset at me for that. But what makes me feel that way? So I care an absurd amount. I'm super sensitive. I can't watch an episode of Modern Family without crying. It's embarrassing. And when I started in open source, all that enthusiasm just kind of exploded. It was oh my God, this is the perfect thing. there's like this community and everyone wants to help each other and there's all these jobs and like everyone's friends and there's all these libraries and there's all these modules and everything was amazing. There's all these projects and everything's great and everyone's great, but no. It turns out that there's a lot of underlying hate, and maybe I still am questioning if in the last 10 years just I have changed or the world has changed, but I think it goes without saying that a lot of this has really bubbled to the surface in the last number of years, and we're dealing with it. So let's quickly list some things that people hate. Languages. That's an easy one. People really love to like give people a hard time because you picked language A instead of language B, and that makes you a bad programmer. It's like you pick the languages that make sense for what you're going to do. But anyways, this is a pit that people often get involved in. Frameworks. This one is really easy, right? It's like we both like the same language, but you do it different, so screw you. We sometimes just don't even bother caring about a reason. We just hate each other because we're terrible. On a more serious note, women. Women get hated on in tech a lot, and it sucks. And I feel greasy and slimy and gross just saying this on a stage, but if we don't say it out loud, we're pretending it doesn't exist, and it does, and it sucks. And in the same way, minorities deal with this as well, and it also sucks. And I also just have like goosebumps even thinking about it. But again, like we need to talk about this. We can't pretend that it doesn't exist, and we can't make decisions pretending that everyone's super friends and all the modules are awesome. They're not. There's literally modules that tell me to kill myself. And that's kind of some of the stuff that we're going to get into. Because over time, you can't ignore these patterns. And myself, I've gotten saltier and saltier and saltier. And while I may have this really bubbly, fun disposition, even I get pushed to my own wit's ends. And I just check out, or I burn out, or I just like feel terrible, or I just don't even have the emotional energy to help grow people who need to learn. And this is important because not everyone is bad, but there is enough bad in our communities to cause people to disengage, and we need to not let that happen. We need to like allow people to feel protected in the spaces that they're in. Raise a hands who thinks meritocracy is a bunch of fucking bullshit. So for those of you who have not heard the term before, meritocracy is the ideology that merit, your work, will bring you to the top of the echelon, that, you know, we recognize the work that you do. By you doing good work, you will get raised up. And while there is a kernel of truth in the idea that like people who build trust through the work that they do get more responsibility, most of the times the idea of the merit that is rewarded is kind of self-perpetuating. Who defines what merit is? The idea that merit and many other things is unambiguous and is apolitical is just not true. So your code is not all that matters, because it turns out your code is made of people. The first iteration of this talk was called Soylent Bits, and it was called Soylent Bits for a reason. Our code is made of people. Everything that we're doing is for people. We're working with people, we're working for people. I mean, some of us were talking about working for machines, but I mean, if you don't want to see the basilisk rise, what we're doing is for the people, not for the machines. People matter. It's just a really cute puppy. I know. Should we, one more time? It's like a people. An unfortunate API. So, as I was saying, I work on Node, and almost 2 years ago now, we were doing some code review, and we found an API. We discovered that there was an API called Suicide in our cluster module. And the really short version is cluster is an API you can use if you want to do web scale inside of Node instead of inside of something else. You have a cluster and it spins up multiple children. If the child dies, then it sets some flags to let you know whether or not the child killed itself. It's a very unfortunate choice of words. And in the code review, we kind of discussed, and we're like, hey, well, maybe we shouldn't have this API. It sucks. And so I was like, okay, well, since it's problematic, maybe we can actually just remove it. And we talked about doing an alias, and we opened another thread. And the thread was number 3721, replace suicide as a verb. And I'm not going to dig into everything that happened, but I'll just scroll. You may see some photos that you recognize in there. There's a large number of people in there who are regulars in the Node world, but there's also a lot of people that were, for lack of a better term, we could call them thirsty randos. And so at the time, we had the Inclusivity Working Group, which has been renamed to the Diversity Working Group and then spun down now we have the Community Committee, because this stuff's hard and we make mistakes all the time, but we're trying. But we started a thread in there on how to avoid the use of problematic language to begin with. And the idea was, like, is there something that we can do? Is this something that we do within the project? We discussed certain tools that use, like, natural language NLP to analyze code and actually let you know if there's problematic words. There's an NPM module called Alex, which can actually lint your code. And this has actually kind of caused some real problems for us. Now, we were just discussing ideas from a philosophical standpoint, but some people started to think that we were about to thought police them, because that's what we want to do with Node. We want to police all the thoughts. And so this thread went off the rails in its own way. And then one user decided to come in and post an eggplant emoji. They had never shown up to our repo before. They had never contributed anything before. And the only thing that they posted was an eggplant. And at this point, we were like trying to deal with all these random people who were coming in, posting different things that were borderline problematic. And this one person was just the most obvious person that was like, okay, you bring nothing, we're going to ban you. And at the time, we didn't really have any moderation policies, and we didn't really have anything set up on how we discuss banning. And we were pretty adamant that we wanted to do everything publicly. So we opened this issue to discuss banning a user for putting an eggplant emoji. And we could scroll through this one. As we all debated whether or not we should ban this person, you could see that I was the one who advocated for locking the issue, which was great. And that's when shit hit the fan. Well, it seems like the demo gods have protected you all, because this was an archive of 4chan. But someone, the person who we banned, went over to 4chan and said, not only are the Node.js people thought policing, but they are destroying everything that is holy and open source, because I can't put an eggplant emoji in a thread without getting banned. And you can imagine what happened. It got posted on 8chan, which I'm not putting any photos of that, but that's the place where people who are too bad for 4chan go. It got posted on Facebook. This one was really interesting. It was a group called Hackathon Hackers. Like literal essays in here about whether or not we should ban that person and whether or not changing this API was a problem. It got posted on Hacker News, as you can imagine. Kotaku in action for those people who enjoy being harassed by Gamergate. That one was fun. And the scariest part of all of this was that consistently people were attacking the ideas of men. That's actually not the scary part. The scary part was that while the ideas of men were being attacked, the women with ideas were being attacked. And it's a subtle difference. There's a huge difference between someone taking like my username and making fun of my username in a 4chan thread versus people who are literally going on to my friends' repos, reviewing all of their code, and then deciding they were not real developers, and then sending pull requests that were harassing, or posting messages to them on Twitter that was harassing. It was really scary. Almost every single woman that I knew that posted in that thread from our community was harassed. And we're not just talking lightly harassed. Some people had their jobs contacted to try to get them fired. Some people were stalked. Some people were ridiculed. And you wonder why people don't want to show up. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Why do you want to get involved in a conversation if you're going to get attacked? And I already said that, so I'm going to skip it. But this is important. This shit's fucking scary. Like, this isn't what I signed up for. It's not what you signed up for. Like, this isn't the everyone is friends sharing lots of modules thing. This is like, hey, how do we protect the people in our community who are getting harassed and stalked? And we have to start to think about like why people react like this. You know, there's one or two actors who are going in. There's some advanced trolling tactics known as concern trolling, who go in and start getting people riled up so that without even realizing it, you have this like kind of groupthink mentality that goes on and people just get upset. To me, it's fear. fear is the reason why people start reacting this way. When people see language being addressed, when people see code of conducts being discussed, they're afraid of these things being weaponized against them. So we decided to open a thread in our inclusivity repo on discussing the concerns around political intolerance as a result of potential intolerance as a result of political correctness. By the way, just using the word PC in a debate with me makes me completely think you're disingenuous and not take a word that you ever say seriously. If you're interested in learning more about the history of the word PC, I have one of the only papers that's written by a Harvard professor about the history of it. She's given me permission to share it around. I can talk to you about it at the party afterwards. As you may imagine, the second thing that was posted on here was a Zizek video, but then, but you can see that this one also, like, oh my God, like who has time for all this? Oh, this was fun. I love that Picard GIF. That was because there was this dude, Highfish, in there, who literally was purposely posting Nazi propaganda so we would delete it, so he could archive it and then claim censorship that we were deleting comments. It's like, dude, we're not going to leave Nazi propaganda on our issue tracker. This isn't like, So what did we do right? Well, we had a code of conduct in place. That was about it at the time. To be honest, like, we didn't have any clear moderation guidelines in place. We did not have a common front. We were arguing with ourselves. In fact, like the first couple comments that came into that issue were between ourselves making like snide remarks. And like, how do you expect other people in other forums to come in and respect your space if you're not even respecting your space yourself? What did we do wrong? A whole bunch. Like arguing over moderating. Not just like banning first and asking questions later for people who are obviously bad actors. We also just were not, like, the not communicating was the biggest thing. Having a code of conduct is not enough, just straight up. Having a code of conduct and not thinking about what you're going to do with it is beyond toxic, because the second that you need to deal with it, you're not ready. A code of conduct without moderation guidelines is useless. If your community simply has a code of conduct guideline and you haven't thought and worked through the process that you're going to deal with it, it is a time bomb. This one's great. Look at those ears. Okay. Whew. What do we do next? And this is like some stuff I'm pretty proud of. I haven't seen other communities do it. The first thing that we did was, like, this isn't unique, but we created a clear moderation guideline, including step-by-step rules for not just one, but various ways in which you can moderate external contributors, so people who don't have commit bits and are just kind of visiting the repo, as well as explicit rules for moderating other collaborators, because these are two different situations that you have to deal with, and they're a little more sensitive. This was the coolest hack that we did. We created a semi-private moderation repo in the Node.js project. Sadly enough, if I just type the word G on my phone in the browser, it autocorrects to this. But our semi-private repo is open to every single person in the org. So it's about, I think, something over 500 or 600 people. Anyone from the org can make an issue in there. Anyone in the org can moderate in there. And it's meant as a place for us to, A, document any moderation needs or concerns, to make requests for threads to be watched, or if there's a disagreement between collaborators, it can actually be a space where that can be worked out in a semi-public way so that it's not derailing the actual thread where we're trying to get work done. So another thing that we did is we started to actively moderate and encouraged others to do the same. Sometimes this is through a public channel, through a bit of a call-out culture that we created. This is like especially the way that we handle a lot of like stuff with gendered language or like things that are kind of like, this isn't really a big deal. We tried really hard to work out the idea of like, certain things involving language should be the same as correcting code. At Google, there's this idea of like, we don't do this here, is like a thing that they talk about for dealing with bias. And so it's not like you are wrong and what you're doing is wrong. It's just, this is not what we do in this space. But we have also found that call-out culture can blow back in your face. We're dealing with lots of people. Not everyone is neurotypical, and not everyone is coming from the same culture. So taking the time to privately deal with some people is sometimes the more empathetic thing to do, and you deal with it on a case-per-case basis. We move those disagreements and discussions to moderation. Having a united front and not fighting between each other in public makes such a huge difference. Like when these 4chan threads were going on and we had literal raids going against multiple of our repos, we would be quoted on 4chan. Like I literally sat for 3 weeks with a Tor browser open, just Googling the thread in Google against all these different URLs, because there were just like every other day we had different attacks and floods coming in. But moving this conversation, not having a divided front, makes a huge difference. Part 3++, so something really fun happened yesterday. Someone opened, oh no, this link's broken, but someone opened another thread about finally removing the suicide API, because we deprecated it. Isaac Schluter from NPM opened a new thread yesterday for us to discuss it again. And the amazing thing that happened was in less than 30 seconds, someone came in and was like, the SJWs are up to it again. And like that was the sound the post made. We immediately locked the thread, deleted that comment, created a thread to track that user to decide if we're going to block that user, and opened a moderation thread to watch that thread and move part of the discussion into moderation for things that we weren't aligned with. I've been on my phone almost nonstop for the last 24 hours because I have a problem, but the reality is we've had almost no fire drills. This hasn't really spread much outside. It got posted to Hacker News, but then got removed right away and moderated from Hacker News. I have seen on Twitter a couple people saying dumb comments, but there isn't like these giant brigades. There aren't these people with a cause. There isn't this like us versus them mentality happening right now, because we acted swiftly, we were clear about what we were planning to do, and we're being extremely clear about the issue too. I'm going to actually go through with BigQuery and analyze every single GitHub repo that has JavaScript in it to find usages of this API. We're going to come up with like 3 or 4 different solutions for each version of Node as to how we can actually fix this, and then vote on it based on like actual stuff, not just scaremongering. I found solution matrices to be much better ways of like coming to consensus rather than like a binary decision. Because with binaries, you create sides and people's like, oh, you're an A and I'm a B, fuck you. But like when you create these matrices of decisions with like 4 different ways of doing it for each branch, like all of a sudden the combinatorial complexity of who you're supposed to hate is too hard, so you just forget about it. And like what we did different here were all the things that I just said, so I'm going to skip this slide. What we're still figuring out, because we don't have this perfect yet. The biggest one for me that I'm thinking a lot about right now is if call-out culture is effective. I was like pretty like up in arms about the fact that I wanted everything public. I want us to have a call-out culture where like pointing out things about culture and language that's not appropriate in our space is the equivalent of making a comment about a lack of a semicolon. It's just like, we don't do this here. This is just not what happens. The problem is like, as pragmatic as it may be, people are not always pragmatic, and people have feelings, and people are embarrassed, and you need to be empathetic about that, especially if you want to bring more collaborators in, you want to grow people. It's important to recognize that not everyone's a bad actor. Most people, in fact, are not bad actors. A lot of people just make mistakes and then double down on them. But if we create a culture that makes people less scared, perhaps we can avoid these situations blowing up. As I said, not everyone is a bad actor. Moderating collaborators. This is a really hard one. First, between different collaborators, what's the appropriate thing to do? Are we supposed to privately message them? If we ask someone to moderate something and then they say, no, fuck you, I'm not going to moderate it, what do you do? We don't really know. That's happened only once, and it was really shitty. We don't really have answers to these things. There's a lot of this that's based on people being civil. But when people feel attacked, they don't act rationally. And that's kind of like the crux of a lot of the problems that we're seeing here. Even more important than between collaborators is leadership. If the leaders of the project are responsible for owning the moderation guidelines themselves, how do you hold your leaders accountable? And this is one of the scary kind of existential trips that I've been dealing with for a while, is like, if you find yourself butting head against a leader and you're kind of a leader, like, there's no one to really report this to anymore. There's kind of like broader existential problems in our world right now around these same things. It's just like, when there's a failure at a leadership level, what do you do? I don't know. Ownership of moderation is another thing. It is kind of problematic that the leaders of our project own the guidelines for moderation. But at the same time, there's a lot of mistrust in people who want to own moderation for the sake of owning moderation. This is similar to the problems that people have in trusting police. So people want the individuals doing the moderating. People want the moderators to be the people who are living in the repo and doing the work, which totally makes sense. Those are the only people who have the context. But at the same time, if they own it, and then they're the ones breaking it, how are they held accountable? But can you hand the ownership of moderation over to a third party and not lose the control of actually being able to do things? Power. It's bad. Closing thoughts. The shit is really upsetting, and it's burning people out. I can, like up and down burnouts over the last 2 years, are absurd. People should not be dealing with it to this extent. But what you can do to help not cause people to burn out is to attempt to not give in to groupthink. Do not give in to fear. It's not always easy, but try to bring your best rational self to situations when you can. At the same time, call people out for being terrible, although sometimes it's kinder to tell them privately. But calling people out is extremely important. One of the biggest problems that I personally think that I've seen in our culture is that for a while people were not being called out. And then if you're having people consistently not being called out, I mean, they're still responsible for their actions, but if you've enabled that behavior in your space, at a certain point it's your own fault also. And this gets really tricky. Hold your leaders accountable. If the people that you look up to are letting you down, tell them. If they aren't doing what they need to be doing, hold them accountable for that. And if you have to, disengage from toxic communities. And it sucks. I don't want that to be our community, and if it has been in the past, I want to make a promise to you that I honestly work every day to make that not the reality. But if that's what you need for your mental health, do it. In the same way I told you to walk out of this talk, if it was bad for you, walk out of our community if it's bad for you. But tell everyone why they're terrible on the way out, because they should know. Be aware of the signs of burnout and take care of yourself. One thought I've been thinking about a little bit is that perhaps we should be thinking about moderation as a support system. Talking again about fear. A lot of the times where I've been in communities of older, more senior individuals who give pushback on the idea of a code of conduct, or pushback even more on the idea of moderation guidelines, the second they hear moderation, they think about the fear of these things being used as weapons. The whole purpose of this stuff is to remove ambiguity. If there's ambiguity here, we're going to spend the whole time bike shitting about what we should do. This stuff doesn't exist to be a weapon to attack people and remove them from communities. It exists to be a support system so that when we need to be there for the most vulnerable people, we are. So maybe even calling it moderation itself is a problem. And I've been thinking through this. Should we call it workbooks? Should we, there's all these different words we could potentially use. Who cares what it's called if we're getting the job done? But just kind of reframing what these things mean are important. This is a kind of sad truth, but there's no single person at the top protecting you. There is no one person in a community, even when I'm on stage telling you come to Node and I will do everything in my power, I'll fuck up. I'll also not always be there. There's no one person. But there is a collection of people protecting a community. Be part of that. Don't rely on one person, but be that person. And don't forget, your code's made of people. Thank you. That's a surfing puppy.
Community is really hard. I just started this new job, and it's community, and it's just, I've always been involved in community, and you're involved in community and have been for a while, but this is the first time where it's my job, so it's just super intense, and yeah, it's a lot of work that I feel goes unappreciated. And you've been saying, you've been on your phone nonstop for about 24 hours. It would be nice to tell everyone just stop for 1 second and let's all live for a while. Do you find the community is getting harder with time, or is it always been kind of has the internet always been a garbage fire, as people call it?
I think it always has garbage fire potential. I think it's at least for me, it's what we've learned in our own space. and improving our space, I genuinely think that like the comparison of the two issues and how we dealt with it is like a perfect example of how our space has been improving. But like I go on Reddit or JavaScript and I want to literally jump into a fire and burn my eyes out. So yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, and I don't know.
30 minutes.
I was wondering if that was the mic about to go off. I don't know if this is the case for you, not being a woman, but for me, I find that the work that I love to do, and I think the work that most people know me for, writing satire, is something I had to stop because of the internet, basically. You mentioned 4chan and 8chan, and 8chan sort of like kind of a recent sort of place, if you will. I see, like, how can we make it so that people like me don't have to stop doing what we love? Like, and I think like with like writing satire, that's like not an open source technology, so it's like we can't have sort of like a moderation group and stuff. I kind of wonder if there's a way that we can train each other, whether we're in the open source community or not, to sort of give back a little to content creators, not just code content creators, but others. Because I feel like I see it working out really well in tech, especially the Node.js community. Like, it's certainly evolved through time, but I'm wondering if there's a way that we can sort of take what we learn, maybe write a book, is basically what I'm saying.
I think one of the biggest problems is we're kind of at the behest of the platforms that we use, and a platform is kind of useless without critical mass, and with critical mass comes critical mass. So, like,
yeah, it's a tough problem, and it's weird that the people expected to solve it, the people who organize communities, are spending all of their time putting out fires to like be able to do that. So it's just really interesting to see if there's ever going to be a way where the two come together and things sort of get better. And I think really the only way we could do that is to build the communities faster with more people, more diversity, not putting the onus on like minorities to do the emotional labor, but also like the white men to do it as well. So you can sort of spread, because you say call people out. It's very easy for white men to call people out. There's nothing happens to you. You know what I mean? Like white men call people out in a negative way, and nothing happens to them. But like I called out someone in the Node.js GitHub repo a few years ago as a Nazi, and I went through hell. That person ended up stalking me to a conference speaker hotel, which is why I don't really typically stay in speaker hotels anymore. But the way it was handled was really well by the code of conduct holders. I think he like reported me to NPM, not realizing NPM and Node are like not the same thing, which shows that like, he was a thirsty rando.
Yeah, I have some names I can ask you later. I think
and you see these characters sort of coming up here and there. The one thing I wrote down was the issue of problematic language and how people are constantly gaslighting those who call out problematic language, and people saying like, oh, like master and slave is just a way that tech is called this, and they always go back to like Linux and stuff like that. Linux, the grand example of the best technology in the world, and community as well. And it's really interesting how engineers will, on one hand, be like, oh, I'm against systemic racism and misogyny, but I'm okay with like these terms that promote that, So I feel like we need to somehow teach more ethics and work that more into, I guess, onboarding community.
So it's really interesting that you bring that up. I skimmed over a few things to make the time, but one of the first arguments that came was, oh, there's all this problematic language in Unix. There's finger and touch, and there's master, and there's slave, and there's all these things that are already a problem. We can't go around changing everything. So we actually went through and did a search and found that there was no other project that ever used the term suicide as an API. And so we were kind of like, okay, cool. Based on your argument, you're arguing for removing it because we are literally the project that in 10 years people will point at and say, oh, it's been here for 10 years. We can't change it now. Like, we're literally in the position to change it now. And they were like, fuck you.
Yeah, it's hard because like that, like, what's going on right now with the evolution of JavaScript is super exciting, and that's why I'm like super stoked about Rust, not only because Rust is a great language and a great project, but they really are kind of becoming the symbol of like how to start a community. And they have a long history of mistakes that have been made to sort of like do that. And us legacy languages have a lot of work to do to go back and fix it, but that's like what we have to do, you know? White people have to understand that slavery happened, and so what are we going to do about it? Even though we didn't, I didn't literally, but still, that's just that's like a burden that I have to bear because of my culture, and that sort of is also in tech. But I don't know. There's just like a lot of education that we have to do, more emotional labor, but
and step in front of the bus when you can too. Like, but the challenge there that I also struggle with is like, I don't want to infantilize or like white knight people who can take care of themselves. So there's always this like really delicate balance. And someone really wise kind of told me that like, if you want to build relationships or help certain minorities or groups, build trust was one thing. And then the other one was like, stop enumerating. I'm big into the idea of intersectionality. Intersection is the fourth dimension, it turns out. And but yeah, like we can't just think about like, this one group or this other group. It's like we are a human race. And now we can't ignore the fact that certain groups need more support and we need to do the extra work for it, but it's not a bucket list. It's just to like, don't be a shithead.
Yeah. And I think, so yeah. So to close out, what is some, besides don't be a shithead, some, I guess, actionable feedback for all of us here to move forward, whether we have like if you're not part, well, you're all part of a community in some way, but like I guess to be more introspective and think of what we can do to improve it. Like for one, I think is improving onboarding process for getting people into like a open source project is including, you know, this kind of stuff, you know. Code of conduct is the easiest but most like most divisive thing for some reason. But what are some other things that we can do you think?
I think on two sides, like as someone in a community trying to bring people in, like try to approach every situation with love and empathy, even when people make it really frickin' hard. And you'll genuinely end up in the right place, and sometimes that place sucks and it's just what it is and people don't want to work with you. I found that this can really be the case. We've seen a couple instances in Node working with people who are not neurotypical, and you know, not everyone is coming to the plate with the same things, and you need to take time and have empathy to work with them. But at the same time, at a certain point, if individuals are genuinely dragging down your community and people, and like your core collaborators are no longer showing up because of an individual, sometimes you got to make hard choices. On the flip side, as an individual, I try to apologize early and often, and don't double down. Like pretty much every single time I see something turn into a tire fire is literally because someone made a mistake and does not know how to apologize.
Yeah, apologizing is hard. So I always say the hardest problem in computer science is listening. So I'm always trying to improve that, and I hope everyone else here is doing the same. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen.